Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Butterfly Effect podcast. Today is analysis 3 of Little Hope, and we're starting off in the graveyard. I'm going to throw it straight over to you, mate, because we get the feeling this is going to be quite a short analysis. There's not a hell of a lot of talking points. There's quite a few visits to the curator here, so it's going to be quite a short episode. But did you have any particular points on like walking around the graveyard with John, Angela and Andrew?
Not really. I mean, it's like you mentioned in your stream, it's kind of, there are some cool replayability things. Like when you know the Vince twist, it's cool. Like, because there's a mystery, like, oh, whoa, fresh flowers in his graveyard. And then it kind of makes sense why they're at the grave. So there's little cool things like that. But you know how in the last part, we made that point about how one thing I think Little Hope almost falls flat on is the fact that the story takes place outside of the main cast. So basically, you're almost like these 5 that we explore, almost like a vehicle. And I don't know, an analogy I can kind of come up with, it's almost like these characters are in a museum, which is funny because we will go to a museum later. But it's almost like the stories lie with the artifacts, and then it almost like the characters themselves, like all kind of forms of any interesting depth get sucked out because they just don't have any, because all we're doing is walking with them, looking at clues. So it's why, for me, Little Hope is the weakest for characters, like, out of all the games. And I know a lot of our fans will hate me saying that, because we've got people, like, that love Andrew, they love Daniel, they love John, they love Angela, but I don't know, that's just my take. But, you know, like, and it's the same for this graveyard, you know, like, I found the clues really interesting. We get the sun rune, you know, we get, like, all the different gravestones, and it's cool just to kind of look back at the Prologue family a little bit. But, yeah, like, it's just, I think that's going to be a common theme we're going to say this part, lad, where a lot of this is just picking up clues.
It really is. It's like, yeah, as the player, as the characters, we're not the driving force of the story. It's very much that we're sort of passive, we're waiting for the story. And I never even thought of it like that before, but actually it's so true. I completely agree with it. But one thing I will give credit for, because once we get out the graveyard scene, we do have a heartbeat sequence. Now, in my theatrical cut, my blind playthrough, I did pass this heartbeat sequence, and I did know about this before I played it, you know, in my recent stream. But if you fail the heartbeat sequence here, when you're hiding and you've got Vince, you know, fiddling around with his bike or whatever, I think it's so interesting because if you fail it, he then looks across and obviously sees you like hiding in the bush and says, "Stupid old fool." And I think because of what we've just seen in the graveyard, with the clues, you know, with the flowers for Tanya, and the fact that, you know, we've got him saying "stupid fool," I'd love to know, and this goes to anyone listening, I'd love to know if anyone failed that heartbeat sequence, and maybe that was like a very big clue or a very big indicator as what the twist was going to be. So I'll throw it over to you, mate. Like, you struggle with heartbeat sequences, you're first to admit it. Do you remember failing this in your blind playthrough at all?
You know what, I think I succeeded it, so I don't think I ever saw that. Weirdly, like, it's 50-50 how I'll do on heartbeat sequences, and I actually did okay with Little Hope. So yeah, I never had that, but I quite like it, because am I right in thinking that as a player on a blind playthrough, if you fail that, you're probably thinking, oh, he's speaking to John? Like, because you're with John at the time, aren't you? And you would think that that's just at John, but of course we know, those that know the twist, he's just seeing like the bus driver like piss about in the bushes. So it's kind of interesting, that.
No, it really is. And you know what? There's something I remember you saying in a previous video. I've got it written down here. We're now going to cut, once that whole scene's finished, we do cut over to Daniel and Taylor. But a little plot flaw that you mentioned in a previous video, lad, basically is that obviously knowing the twist, i.e. that actually Anthony is playing Andrew here, and he's imagining all these things. It's a little bit of a plot flaw that how on earth is he imagining what Daniel and Taylor are doing? You know, because where the characters have split up, and if he is playing the role of Andrew here, how on earth does he know what's going on? So I don't know if you wanted to like go into that a little bit more, or just sort of agree with what you were saying previous.
Yeah, I do, and I did think that, and it's funny because we compare this game heavily with Man of Medan, don't we? And for me, Man of Medan, the twist was too predictable. It was too simple. This game, I found it like almost the opposite. I found it almost too complicated, and I know it speaks stuff about mental health, and Andrew's going through something very unique that no one can 100% truly understand. But yeah, like I get the whole twist is like the trauma, the head injury, and there's an element of psychosis there, I imagine. But yeah, like how on earth is he imagining his family grown up like with him, and then kind of like some people split off? Because like when Daniel and Taylor go off and doing their bits, how's he kind of like imagining and seeing what they're up to, going in and out the buildings and the items they're finding and stuff? So whether that's a flaw or me struggling to understand it, I am unsure, but I do think it is kind of something worth highlighting, and maybe someone in the comments can kind of help me out on that one, because I am kind of struggling a little bit there.
Because yeah, like when you have the ending, and like, you know, especially like if he's getting arrested, Andrew gets into the car, the camera pans round, and you then see the bus driver. So we're led to believe that, and even some of like the little dialogue bits that they show, you know, he's taking the voice of Will Poulter. So yeah, unless we're led to believe that somehow when we're playing as Daniel and Taylor, we're also the bus driver, but it's just, you know, sometime later, or I don't know, it is a little bit of a muddle, and it's something I never noticed before, but thinking about it, you are absolutely right. But like you say, if anyone could help in the comments, that would be much appreciated. But yeah, moving on, we now have this scene with Daniel, more reasons to not like Daniel, being a terrible boyfriend. All they had to do was cross a bridge, and he was still asking Taylor to basically cross for him. And then there's they have a flashback scene, they encounter John's counterpart for a little bit, expressing his concerns about Mary. And then we're back with Andrew, Angela and John outside the church. What are your thoughts on this particular scene, mate, with the sewers and Angela getting taken?
This was kind of like the real first sense of jeopardy I felt in the game. I felt the bridge scene that we would have ended on in the last analysis, it just felt a little weird, like they just fell down. It looked pretty easy to get them up, and the thing was crawling, and I don't know, it just felt like a bit like that chase scene we're going to mention at another point, you know, that we always highlight the flaws of. But I don't know, this one, like Angela's monster with like the chains generally felt quite terrifying, and when she was getting dragged in the drain and you had to deal with the QTEs, there was a point where I was like, oh, I could lose a character here. So yeah, I quite liked the drama and yeah, the terror of the whole thing.
You know what? While you've got me thinking there, have you got a particular favourite? Like, what demon would you be like most or like least wanting to come up against?
Tell you what, in terms of favourite, I will say Taylor's, for the pure factor that a prologue choice can affect what kind of monster you get. And also, I do think if you pick the hanging one, the floating demon with its like, I don't know, like for example, you know, I used to play that game Dead by Daylight, you know, which we talk about quite a bit because of Frank Stone coming out soon. But one of the villains you can face is called the Nurse, and I find her terrifying because she's the one character who doesn't like walk on the floor, you know, she floats and her feet are like above the ground, and I don't know why, there's just something slightly chilling to me about that. So yeah, I would say Taylor's is for that, for the variety and the sheer chilling. But there is just something really chilling as well about John's, because I think that might be your favourite as well, right?
I think so. It's like, it's difficult because I really like Angela's one, like especially if you get her killed in the choice previous, where you know it catches her with the chains and you can hear them, the metal clanging, pulling her in. And then she gets drowned by that like black gunk, I can only describe it as, all over her mouth. That's just a really sort of epic and dark way to go. But there is something about John's one, the way it scuttles. There's something about a creature being very quick, very unpredictable, the way the limbs are all over the it's just really unsettling. So it's definitely between one of them two. But I feel like a fair shout out to the one for Daniel as well, like with the spears, like that as well can like bring some like really epic deaths. But
that's
yeah,
one thing as well we've not mentioned, right? The monsters are directly related to the prologue deaths, right? So and the flashback deaths, right? They almost mirror one another, right? So for example, John, like James gets crushed in the house. and then his execution, which we'll see later, is him getting crushed by the stones, right? Thus his monster is kind of this like broken, scuttling beast. You know, and then like Taylor's will be the same, because I believe she can get hung out the church and she hangs, you know, in the prologue. Well, Tabitha does. And Dennis, obviously, yeah, we get the spiking, right? Now I can't quite remember how like Daniel's like flashback character gets executed, actually, because I don't think that's come up for us yet. But am I right in remembering Angela's older character, I believe, Amy maybe? I think one gets drowned, right? You know, in the flashbacks where she gets executed.
Yeah, yeah.
And am I right in thinking the other one simply dies from the house fire from like inhalation and coughing, right?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Is that a flaw, or should she have maybe drowned in the bathtub to keep up with the water theme?
Yeah, because this is what I was thinking, and this is where it comes back to that bigger question, and it comes back to that Man and Madan Little Hope debate that we had. And this is why Little Hope is somewhat so frustrating to me, because when you talk about the depth, the little details that this game has, it's absolutely fantastic. You've just alluded to it there. You've got the deaths that are then shown again in sort of that how the beasts come through, but also the fact that they represent the elements. How you've got what it should have been a drown in the bathtub, if you ask me personally, because you've got the whole water thing. You've got Earth thing for John getting crushed by the stones in the flashback. Of course, you've got Taylor's one. She can either be hung or she can be burnt in the flames. So you've got like fire and air there as well. Also for Dennis, I mean, I'm guessing you could somewhat say that that's air as well, because he's then falling from his death. So like, there's such a good variety there, and the way it's been knitted together is so strong, and therefore that is why, you know, while the story and some of the deeper elements to it are brilliant, it really does then become a shame when you look at the gameplay and the blandness of the main 5 characters that ultimately pulls this down, because it is one of them things that ultimately does stick in my mind when I look back at this game. But yeah, as far as what you were saying, mate, it's certainly, for me, it should have been water based, because actually it's just her choking on the smoke, isn't it, from the house fire?
That's the thing, and the point you mentioned about it being a shame, I almost think like let's bust another analogy out, right? I imagine these games like, let's say it's like a house, right? And then like, to have the house, you need all the foundations to keep it like level. And these foundations to me are things like story, graphics, gameplay, characters. Now, a game like Until Dawn, they knock it out the park in all of them, thus the house is like level. And I feel like one thing that's a shame, and I don't think it's just Little Hope, I think it's like all the DPA games, is that like where one game will do everything almost right, one game like drops the ball in story, one game will drop the ball in like characters, and thus it's a shame, because it's like all the elements are there, but they always forget that. They just almost neglect that one ingredient in each game, don't they? And it's why there's not been a perfect DPA game for me yet. I don't know if that's fair to say.
I think so, even going as far as the Quarry as well, you know.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like I feel like what is the biggest criticism we say of the Quarry? It's post chapter 8. The ending of a game, as annoying as it is incredibly important of how you wrap things up. And obviously we're going to get to the ending of Little Hope, and perhaps in another video as well, like the twist and stuff. But yeah, like the story is certainly the centerpiece, but you can't neglect some of these other ingredients that build it up as well. And I think you are right, it's just that, and actually, like we've said this before, could Until Dawn, you know, be their best ever? Will it ever be topped? Because it's one of those, it's just so perfect. It's like the stars have aligned. And it seems like every game since has been a little bit of a hodgepodge. Like there's good bits here, bad bits there, and so on. So yeah, I completely get that. But yeah, coming back to this scene, I mean, as a quick comment from me, before, because they spot the little girl and that's what kicks it all off, they chase after the little girl. It comes back to a point you've said before, mate, about dialogue. Some of like the screams and that, when she's getting pulled in, are good, but a bit beforehand, it's like you're stood outside, it's foggy, it's dark, you know, there's a ghost of a little girl. And just the line delivery from Angela, she says this, she's like, why don't you just leave us alone? And as a player, like, I'm not feeling the jeopardy. I'm not feeling the fear factor at all. So, like, going into this, I was a little bit like, yeah, okay. Like, it could have been done a little bit better, which again is a shame because in other aspects they did really well with it, and especially in The Devil in Me too. But another thing being is that I really like, it's a good example of curators cut this bit. The fact that you can go down into the sewers as John, I really like it. Like, that's something they didn't necessarily have to do. They could have just kept him up top and then, you know, headed into the building with Andrew, albeit short, but I do like that. Also, they do it later on in this episode. The fact that, you know, when you're playing as Daniel and Taylor and you're walking around that museum, and Taylor then goes into the room by herself, and only in Curator's cut do you get to see what happens on the other side of that door. So, like, they, you know, there are elements again that are, you know, they do very well, and it is always good for certain replayability reasons to see things that you would have otherwise missed out on in the theatrical cut. So obviously with Andrew and John, we then do go into the museum. Obviously, I mean, I'm pretty sure, I can't even remember, what did I do in my blind playthrough now? Don't think I burned it in my blind playthrough.
Am I right in thinking you did burn it in the stream though?
I did in this one because, you know, it's
yeah,
chaotic, you know, just burn it. But actually, this isn't the main point that I was going to bring up here, because we do visit the museum consecutively twice. Maybe this is bias on my part because of the game that I'm going to mention. But for some reason, in Little Hope, I didn't like it. You know how you're with Andrew and John in the museum, and then literally the next scene, or shortly after, you're then in the museum again with Daniel and Taylor. Whereas we've literally played Heavy Rain recently, and you play as Madison in the nightclub, you head up, you're talking to Paco, you have that whole scene, you leave, and then you're playing as Norman, and you're going to the same location, which is weird because I loved that. That in the analysis, I remember saying that I loved that you was then in the same location but with a different person. But for some reason in Little Hope, I didn't like it this time around, and I don't know if that's a bias thing. I don't know if that's because I'm just not as invested in these characters and this story in order to, you know, revisit a location. But it just felt a little bit lazy to me, mate. Do you think that's fair, or what's your take on it?
Snap to you, to be honest, mate. I have that written down. So for me, and you know, you mentioned Heavy Rain, the nightclub. That's interesting because I thought of a different example. Back to Until Dawn, where you're Mike going around the sanatorium. Now, I know, you know, you can bash the sanatoriums from a replayability point of view, but I think on your blind playthrough, like, at least, like, there is horror. Like, I was on the edge of my seat walking through it in Chapter 5. And at least when you go back to it in Chapter 9, not only is there a pause, you visit other characters and you go back to it, and it's later on in the game, but you visit other parts of the sanatorium. You're going through all the cells, and you're going into, like, the Wendigo pits and stuff. With this one, don't get me wrong, like, you know, you do find different clues, and if you burn the poppet, which we'll talk about in a bit, you can see the ashes when you're Daniel and Taylor later. But to me, it just seemed weak that Andrew and John went through a museum, they left it, and then Taylor and Daniel walk through the exact same room moments later, and you're just looking at more of the same stuff. And it's odd. Like, yeah, there's different clues, but that is the only positive there. And I almost question and wonder why they made that executive decision to have that in the game.
Yeah, I didn't get it either. And you know what? While we're on this, like, sort of little criticism wave, you have this moment, and this is something I hope that they get rid of. And it's not even like I can say this is exclusive to Little Hope, because it even happens in Until Dawn as well. I just feel like the areas of horror that they've introduced, even briefly, have been so much more effective. And I'm talking about the eerie horror, whether that's, you know, the Devil in Me thing with Erin. Even in this game, when you're walking about, you have a mannequin that can drop, and, you know, that can scare the shit out of you. There's lots of moments like that where they do really good. But what I'm on about is there's one point you pull back something, and then the camera zooms in and it goes quiet, and it's quite clear that a jump scare's coming. Just a black cat that's like walking along the windowsill, and it is something that I hope going into series 2 that we see less of, like less of a reliance on jump scares and loud audio to get the player, because I think it sort of diminishes the talent that's clearly at Supermassive. Like, they've got pedigree there to do some really interesting things with horror because we've seen it, you know. So it's one of them things, yeah, going forward I just hope that they take out. But back to the doll thing, mate, do you remember what you did? Did you burn the doll in your playthrough, or?
On my blind playthrough, I didn't, because Andrew makes a good point of now we could piss it off. And when John was full on in there, like, oh yeah, we should burn it, I just was instantly just like willing to challenge it. But also, whether this again is poor writing, and sorry if you're a massive Little Hope fan and you've just been crying for 23 minutes as I critique the game, but like, I don't know, like, you know, there's just that common thing, and you're a fan of crime and murder mystery, but when there's just that common suspect, there's just that thing of, well, it's not going to be them. So we've been led to believe this whole game that the little girl's a witch. And I don't know, I just was there like, well, it's not going to be that. So when it's like, oh, should we burn the poppet? I'm like, well, no, I don't want to do that. And also it could be evidence. So like, I don't think we should. So yeah, I don't know, like, I get like you could lean into it from like the whole possession standpoint if that's kind of where you're at, because obviously the plot of the game isn't quite set in stone yet at this point in a blind playthrough. You don't quite know what to expect, so you might have done that. But I don't know, I just was like, nah, the game is kind of telling me to do this, and this is just kind of like a really tactfire way of kind of going for that common belief that Mary's the villain here. So I was like, nah, I'm not doing it.
I'm convinced as well that the curators even said to you, oh, you know, she's just a little girl, don't blame her, you know, every saint has a past, every sinner has a... I think we've already covered that, maybe not, but do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I think even going by your reasoning, it's not going to be as cut and dry. We sort of saw it with Madan. It's not actually going to be ghosts of World War II people on a ship. It's clearly like this Manchurian gold causing hallucinations and stuff. So there's always going to be another twist. So that's what my reasoning basically was in my blind playthrough as well. But like we mentioned, we do go back to the museum with Daniel and Taylor. We have the little mad moment with Taylor and her flashback. She's clearly next. And the only thing I've really got to add else in this particular bit, mate, is that when I grabbed the knife, I gave it to Daniel. Of course, this time around, I had very strong motives, which was to try and keep him alive as much as possible. But I'm pretty sure I did in my blind playthrough as well. And maybe, again, this is another thing, because we've seen it in The Devil in Me with like the whole screwdriver shenanigan business. Is that when you find something and you get a choice, whether to keep it for yourself or whether to give it to the other person, whether actually it might be a nice mix to actually keep it for yourself, because generally it seems to be, yeah, give it to the other person because, you know, it's the nice thing to do, and, you know, they're probably going to get a situation later on where they're going to need it. I just wonder if that could be something they look at as well.
Yeah, it's such a random choice because you have no idea who's going to be where later on. So Until Dawn, the flare gun, The Devil in Me, the screwdriver, like, there is like a few like methods to the madness. So like in Devil in Me, I always said, well, Jamie's the one running out, she needs to have the screwdriver as a weapon, right, since Kate's back here in the safe room. But like, yeah, with that one, with this Little Hope one, I genuinely don't remember what I did. This was like, what, 4 years ago now perhaps? So yeah, like, it's just a very difficult one. But yeah, no, I do get your point. It'll be nice to kind of have variety, and maybe, I don't know if like it's unrealistic to say, but maybe clarity on which one is like, you know, which way you should do it.
No, I can't think of there being any specific reasoning. I mean, you get the dialogue moments and she literally says, do you want it? And he goes, why? And it's like, you know, for protection and stuff. So perhaps actually The Devil in Me is an improvement on that, because at least you knew that Jamie was going into a situation where she was going to need it. The only caveat to that is that we have a very misleading premonition that would suggest that, you know, she's going to get squashed by the glass. So it's, you know, a little bit unfair there. But no, I don't know. I don't think there is actually any other reasoning, mate. I think it's just a 50-50 as to who you give it to. And I don't know actually what happens if you don't give it to Daniel. I could only assume that, because you can't be punished. You surely can't die. Maybe you get some more QTEs or something like that when he encounters his demon.
That's it. But yeah, I mean, with the poppet burn though, like at least it's cool that you know, this decision will affect the ending, which is really cool. You could argue maybe quite late on in the game. Like, I always praise Man of Medan for the branching. Like, Conrad being on and off the ship can happen really early. But yeah, I don't know. With this, it's kind of like almost just felt like one linear journey. And now it's getting to the point where the choices actually matter, where people can actually die off and stuff. So, I don't know, would you say that Little Hope is almost guilty of kind of like the game not mattering till very late?
I mean, yeah, kind of. It's almost like the 50%. It's like you get through half the game pretty much unscathed. I mean, the thing is with the Angela choice, it's a very easy choice. Of course, you're going to save Angela. You know, when it's Angela, John. I mean, where I got screwed over was, yeah, like the whole heroic versus fearful thing. You know, I think I was okay with Angela. I think it was Daniel, I think I actually screwed up a QTE and he died. And then the other two, I think I got them to the end, but because I picked fearful instead of heroic, that's why the demons come back and got them too. Hence why I finished with Andrew and Angela. But yeah, I mean, it is, you know, it's perhaps another little criticism perhaps you could add, that maybe some of the choices should be more meaningful from the start, but I almost understand why, because you otherwise enter a territory where, you know, you could have very little characters and then you've got to bring an earlier ending and whatnot. So, but then after that, mate, it's a curator scene. But you know what? This has been quite a bashing Little Hope episode, so I'm going to try and finish on a positive. And what I would say is, in particular, with this curator scene that I played through, I do like the little moments, the little sort of branching things coming into effect when you're talking to him. So he really does acknowledge your choices. So like, for instance, I missed the gun in the earlier part. In this part, like I said, I've picked up the knife. So he'll say something like, at last you have a weapon. And also as well, he mentions about the whole burning the poppet choice as well. So I do like that, because let's face it, they could easily just put a copy and paste curator thing pretty much in every single one, just deliver some nice lines, not really acknowledge the choices until perhaps the end game. But the fact that it is a little bit more personable due to what you've done throughout your gameplay, I think that's a good thing to mention.
For sure, and I do think House of Ashes has the weakest of the lot, and I think when you look back at Little Hope, you realise just how good the curator scenes are in this game.
Okay guys, so yeah, that was analysis of part 3 of Little Hope. Do let us know what your choices were, what your thoughts on the game was, and also what we've mentioned in this episode. Have we been too harsh? Do let us know in the comments, and do keep an eye out for next week, where we're going to be doing the next part of Little Hope. Catch you later.
Ciao for now, guys.